Hello, I'm Dr. Jamie Williams from Nottingham Trent University.
And I'm Dr. David Wright from Nottingham Trent University.
And today we're going to be presenting some of the findings of our research into the United Kingdom's daily coronavirus briefings.
Thank you. So I'll start and then I'll pass to Jamie partway through the talk before returning at the end for the final conclusion slide. On the 9th of March 2020, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson gave his first televised address to the nation about COVID-19. This was followed shortly after by another on the 12th of March, and then from the 16th of March, the government committed to giving the public daily updates through televised briefings, and a briefing was broadcast from Downing Street almost every day until June last year. However, as the crisis unfolded in the UK, there was criticisms of both inaction and confused messaging levelled at the government, to the extent that the briefings were described as, quote, a lesson in how not to do government communications in the British Medical Journal. We can see here on the slide an extract from Matt Hancock's daily briefing on the 27th of May last year. And we've put this slide here because it draws, it foregrounds particular attention to the use of the first person plural pronoun we. We has been analysed extensively in political discourse analysis, and work as early as the 1990s has identified that we holds manipulative possibilities for politicians. They use it to good effect to indicate, accept or deny or distance themselves from responsibility for political action, to reveal ideological bias, to encourage solidarity, to designate and identify those who are supporters and those who aren't, as well as present specific aspects of the individual politician's own identities. And it's the responsibility element of we that we are primarily concerned with in this talk. The COVID-19 pandemic has sparked different political strategies across governments of the world, including divergent strategies for disseminating and communicating information to their citizens. And there is some existing research already from different parts of the world. Some studies have analysed the ways in which discourses of unity and togetherness and collective actions are used by politicians as a means by which to build trust and persuade citizens to comply with various COVID-19 related rules and restrictions. Other studies have analysed political speeches about COVID-19 for metaphor and the way in which metaphor has framed the virus as an invisible foreign enemy and a dangerous threat in order to legitimise and rationalise their policies and restrictions. So on the slide now, we can see the data that we used for our study. As mentioned, Boris Johnson gave his first continuous daily briefing on the 16th of March and continued almost daily to the 23rd of June last year. In total, there were 92 briefings, and which totaled a modest corpus of just under 118,000 words. We've extracted all of these briefings and all of these words from the number 10 Downing Street's official government website. These daily briefings were multi-genre. There was a monologue at the beginning where the Prime Minister or other ministers, as you can see on the slide now, give monologic information to the viewers. There was question and answer sequences whereby members of the public and members of the press were invited to ask questions, which both the government minister and various representatives, usually from public health, were tasked with answering those questions. We only focus on the monologic element, the speech element, because it represents the preparedness or the point in these daily briefings where the government representative had the most control over what they were saying. And these daily briefings have been analysed already by some discourse, in some discourse studies, though at this point they've been analysed as part of a broader patchwork of different types of public communication or communication generally about COVID, alongside pamphlets, websites, press releases, newspaper articles, and so on. Mike Billig, for instance, is focused on how across these different types of communication, including the daily briefings, the government have used statistics and numbers as to their rhetorical advantage and to achieve political ends. Other studies, such as Jarvis's, have identified how temporal claims situate the virus historically and predict its future. And other studies have analysed the ways in which the good citizen is constructed and how the government's communication was initially complacent and then was later characterised by following the science. So what differentiates our study is that we are isolating just these daily briefings, although they did occur in a broader context of communication about COVID. Obviously, we're isolating just these texts and analysing them in and of themselves. The methodology that we took to analysing these daily briefings is on the next slide. It was a two-part methodology in which we first of all identified all instances of we. Now, not only do we know from the literature and previous research that we is a contextually salient word in political discourse, it serves a particularly important function, but so too was it statistically salient. It was the fifth most common word altogether in our data set, which you can see on the table on the left. So each instance of the first person personal pronoun we and other first personal pronouns were manually coded. We're just talking about we in this study, but we did code, in fact, Jamie coded the entire range of personal pronouns. And the two-stage process, first of all, involved identifying who that we was referring to. Now, this is not a straightforward task for reasons I'll explain in a couple of, on the next slide. So the first stage involved identifying who we are, who we is being used to refer to, and then after that, the second stage involved identifying the transitivity patterns to see which process types in particular were being ascribed to different reference of we. So I referred earlier to the fact that identifying who we refers to is not an easy task, and that is because working out who we includes and excludes is only discernible by analysing those words in context. We were concerned at this analysis, although the analysis itself was more fine-grained, but the way in which we're presenting it here is the binary distinction between inclusive and exclusive we. Exclusive we is in some way exclusive of, particularly hinging along members of the public, whereas inclusive we is far more encapsulating and does implicate members of the public. Much of the early research on personal pronouns, and this was identified in particular by Zupnik's study in 1994, identified the fact that although studies do use pronouns and they do ascribe inclusive and exclusive readings to pronouns, this work had not directly addressed the complexity involved in doing this, and the process by which analysts arrived at determinations of inclusivity or exclusivity were opaque and were not discussed explicitly. And this has largely continued to be the case over the last almost 30 years. So for that reason, we've designed what you can see on the slide now, which is a proposal or some guiding principles that we followed that allows us or allowed us to code pronouns as being inclusive or exclusive in particular. These were guiding principles, and we offer them here as transparent and hopefully replicable means by which other discourse analysts can do the same. The first stage involved identifying whether there was some explicit disambiguation in the nominal group. Is there some explicit mention as to who we refers to? In that case, it was relatively easy to identify the pronoun as being inclusive or exclusive. If not, the next stage was, does the semantic context or our world knowledge, the semantics of the inclusive or exclusive meaning, make particular sense? If that helped, then we encoded it that way. If not, then we asked, does the lexical cohesion or anaphoric references within the text or the linguistic environment favour one reading or another? And if not, what was the referent of the current cohesion chain? What was the last referent of the last use of we? So we offer these here as a means by which we coded instances of we, and other people might follow. All instances of we in the data, 3,156, were coded independently as being inclusive or exclusive by both Jamie and I. The inter-rater reliability for that was 85.88% and was deemed substantial by Cohen's kappa, with a kappa rating of 0.68. There were 477 points of disagreement where Jamie and I couldn't agree on whether the reading was inclusive or exclusive. Of these, 339 were resolved through post-analysis discussion, but 138 couldn't be resolved, and we coded those as ambiguous. The next stage then, after we'd done that, was to code or to identify the transitivity patterns, or in particular the process types that were ascribed to each of these inclusive and exclusive readings. And we can see this is just a brief overview quantitatively to show that material processes dominate both inclusive, exclusive, and ambiguous readings. And for that reason, we're going to focus this study in particular on different types of material process and the implications they have for roles and responsibilities. And my final slide here then shows the different process types that were, or the most common process types, the top 10 in terms of frequency for exclusive and inclusive readings. We've highlighted here those that are shared. Take, do, and make were within the top 10 most frequent collocates for both exclusive and inclusive readings. And these are fairly general material processes. By contrast, in those that differ, those that are distinctive of exclusive or inclusive we see on the left-hand side, exclusive we is most commonly associated with the processes such as provide, help, and support, while inclusive readings have those which are intuitively more closely related to actually addressing issues of the virus in terms of control, beat, save, and protect. And I will pass to Jamie now for an in-depth analysis of some of these in action.
Thank you. So from this point then, is we had a look at some of the most common types of things we saw in the exclusive type, these very general verbs of taking, making, and doing. And one particular pattern started to emerge was when the government or government speakers were using these types of material processes, they did so predominantly in certain types of constructions, such as we see on the slide here, taken from Boris Johnson's speech on the 22nd of March 2020. So it says here, we, which we class as exclusively, and we agreed upon that, have to take special steps to protect the particularly vulnerable. So interesting, in this case, we have that that verb protect. And as David said in the last slide, protect appeared most frequently with the inclusive reading, whereas here it's appearing in a clausal context with the exclusive reading. But we argue there's a subtle difference between the ways these context important verbs such as protecting, saving, and these kinds of things are being used by government speakers in different types of contexts. Because if we focus upon kind of the more fine-grained transitivity structure of the embedded clause here, you'll notice it contains an implicit actor, right? So we have to take special steps. So we there acting as the actor who is taking the steps. And then if you think about, well, who is the actor of protecting within that transitivity pattern? Well, it's implicit. And if you fill in kind of the implicit gap, what you see is actually it is the steps themselves which are acting as the actor within this material process. This is in contrast, if you like, to a much more direct way of expressing a process of protecting, something like we have to protect the particularly vulnerable. We didn't see this more direct means of talking about protecting and saving when the government was using the pronoun in an exclusive manner. They used the type of constructions on the top here in order to kind of distance themselves a little bit from the act of protecting. This is in contrast, as David has already alluded to, when we see the first person pronoun being used in the inclusive manner. So in these cases, we do see a very kind of direct description of the whole country, including the public, being an explicit actor in these kinds of very important material processes, which are describing actions taken to reduce the effects of the COVID-19 virus. So in this example here, what we have is we, again being used inclusively, need to slow the spread of the virus and strengthen the NHS's ability to protect us all. Here we think about some of those same kinds of verbs again. Here, slowing the virus, a step to counter COVID-19. We have an explicit inclusive reading of that pronoun here. Again, what we don't see, or what we didn't see as frequently in the inclusive reading, was examples like this one in green. We didn't see the inclusive reading being used in the same kind of constructions which we did with the exclusive reading. So clauses such as "we need to take measures to slow the spread of the virus" tended to take place primarily with the exclusive reading, whereas the ones like on the top were used in with the inclusive reading. And here are some more examples taken from various data points in the data set just to illustrate this wider pattern. So at the top there, you can see that this was from various different points in the data set. So you have two examples there from April by Dominic Raab and Alok Sharma, and then again later in June by the Health Secretary, or at the time Health Secretary, Matt Hancock. And then just to illustrate, and the ones in red there, I've coded those with a subscript E to indicate it's the exclusive reading in that case. And you can see the same kinds of patterns. The steps we are taking to defeat coronavirus, the steps we are taking to defeat this pandemic, we are taking further steps to protect the NHS. And if we think about, well, who is the grammatical actor of defeating and protecting there, it's the steps. It's not the pronoun. In contrast then to the ones in blue at the bottom, which are all coded here as inclusive, then we have again a much more direct description of agency to the public at large. We must continue to control the virus. We must continue to save lives. We can control the virus. We are going to beat this disease. So there was a stark pattern in very similar kinds of sentences, but subtle grammatical differences potentially having an impact upon the representation of steps, and as we will argue now, in the ascription of responsibility. Because if you think about these kinds of patterns, and I've just constructed these three examples on the left here to illustrate the wider pattern, if we think about what is classically thought about how things like clause patterning and transitivity structure relates to ideas such as agency, when people are giving kind of ascriptions or giving material processes, the agent or the actor in that on standard discourse, critical discourse analysis positions has some kind of agency and therefore some kind of responsibility. So looking at these three examples on the left, which are kind of illustrative of the different kinds of grammatical patterns we saw in our data set, the one at the top, where we is acting as a direct agent, a direct actor, kind of encodes the most responsibility on the people being represented, whereas the ones further down encode less responsibility because we there is not playing the direct role as the actor in those transitivity patterns. And to reiterate, the one at the top we found most commonly patterned in the inclusive readings, and the two at the bottom with this decreased responsibility we found patterning with the exclusive purely government reading. Turning now finally just to briefly talk about another way in which we think responsibility matches up to pronominal reference and transitivity structure is through those truly ambiguous cases which David mentioned earlier, the ones which we could not agree on an inclusive or an exclusive code for. And these are kind of some of the thematic analysis of the types of meanings these pronouns were appearing in. And see the most frequent one here again were measures against COVID. I just want to talk about a few examples, or just one example of this, just to show the way how the ambiguity arises and how this has effects upon the actions and the responsibility being encoded. So if we have a look at this extract from Dominic Raab on the 21st of May 2021, and you just read through this little extract, we have, again, a number of instances of this first person plural pronoun. And whoever we is referring to is being represented as building national infrastructure, putting in place building blocks, developing tests, building centres, building lab capacity, and creating home testing kits. These are not things which the public has any say in. These are not things the public are actively doing. So on the verbal semantics alone, you might be biased towards an exclusive reading here. However, when one looks at the surrounding context, and we have a look at ideas such as cohesion and the reference of the previous discourse, you can see that this particular example followed a quite lengthy period of inclusive reference. So the blue examples here all indicate inclusive readings of the first person plural pronoun. So we must all renew our efforts, unambiguously there referring to the whole country, people all across the UK. We all playing our part in a national effort. You can kind of see how all these words here are biasing things towards an inclusive reading. So the question is then, when we come to the bit in green here, our verbal semantics are buying us towards an exclusive reading, but yet the preceding context is buying us towards an inclusive reading. And this is how the ambiguity arises. And then again, if we think about the kinds of processes being represented here, we have again crucial things to counter the virus: building infrastructure, developing tests, creating kits. And so again, this muddying of the water of who are doing these things in this case again lowers the direct responsibility being ascribed to the government, because they have not created an explicit reference to themselves only in this case. And here are just some other examples. I don't have the space to show the full context, but here are some other examples of some of the ambiguous cases marked A here, marked in green, and you can see the kinds of other kinds of meanings we have here, the other kinds of process types we have here: restricting contact, slowing the spread of infection, building capacity, doubling capacity, creating labs. All these things again, which the government, particularly in the idea of building things, the government is primarily doing it out there in the real world, but the ambiguity is used to lower their responsibility by hiding the particular referent of the pronoun in these cases.
And by way of conclusion, just some brief points. While the government represent themselves generally as provider, helping and supporting, the inclusive properties of the first person plural pronoun were used to construct collective responsibility with the people for the political and social actions that were taken to directly tackle the virus. We found, as Jamie has demonstrated, the government employed different lexical grammatical strategies to reduce and mitigate the amount of responsibility to themselves while increasing the amount assigned to the general public, using strategy that we call in our analysis grammatical distancing and a construction of a hierarchy of responsibility. At the same time, we argue that the government strategically invoked the inherent ambiguity of way over the course of the briefings to render opaque precisely who is responsible for key, important and contextually pertinent processes and actions involved with fighting the virus. Thank you.